monopoly does something beneficial to gain that position, and not to places where it does something harmful. And an indiscriminate subsidy for market power may not do a very good job at distinguishing those types of situations. So, like any other externality or tax, we can calculate the distortion created by monopoly using the standard Harberger triangle argument, which is that the marginal distortion created by decrease in quantity is equal to the wedge between willingness to pay and willingness to accept, the markup, times the quantity, right? We do that for taxes. If this was the tax formula, the effect on social welfare would be T times dq. If it was an externality, it would be the size of the marginal externality times dq. And here, the externality is exactly the markup of the monopolist tax, right? And so we can just measure this with a standard deadweight loss triangle. Really, the only difference in the case of monopoly, which we'll explore in a little bit, is that the actual size of this is determined by the monopoly's optimization. And this gives it a particular shape and relationship to the monopoly's profit. Now, one very important thing to note is that this formula, like all the standard formulas for welfare with externalities or taxes, assumes that every other commodity is supplied perfectly competitively with no externalities and so forth. Right? Now, that may seem, well, look, that's reasonable in other circumstances, it must be reasonable here. But the important thing to note is that that means that all the substitutes for the monopoly's product, the things that people buy instead of the monopoly's product when it reduces its quantity, must have no markup on them at all. That is, any competitor of the monopolist must be a perfect competitor. And that's actually a pretty problematic assumption, because the truth is, in many industries, a firm might have market power, but it might just not have an overwhelmingly larger amount of market power than any other firm to which consumers substitute. And if consumers substitute to another good, which has a positive markup, that creates an externality for the producer of that other good, right? So the real formula for monopoly deadweight loss is not what I put up at top, but it's really this thing here. The markup of the monopolist minus the average markup of products to which the consumers substitute rather than buying the monopolist product times dq. So what that tells us is that it's not really monopoly power itself that creates the distortion. It's the fact that monopoly power is unevenly distributed across different firms. If all firms had the same amount of monopoly power, it would be perfectly competitive. It would be just as efficient as if things were perfectly competitive. So another thing that says, for example, just to bring this home, is that if there's a bunch of monopolistic firms, and then a perfectly competitive firm enters to compete with them, that's really bad, right? So in fact, it's just as bad if a perfectly competitive firm enters to compete against a bunch of monopolists as it is if a monopolist enters to compete against a bunch of perfectly competitive firms. So it is the dispersion of monopoly power, not its existence, that creates social laws. Yeah?
This average markup, is it weighted by the degree of substitution?
It's weighted by the fraction, it's the quantity of substitution weighted average markup of the other firms to which the consumers substitute. So just to emphasize this one more time, imagine you take a model like they do in international trade with market power in general equilibrium, and you can consider two different versions of the model. In one case, there's like a bunch of companies that are monopolistic, and then there's some outside numeraire good which is perfectly competitively supplied. In that model, there's going to be tons of distortions. There's going to be too little produced by all the monopolistic firms. It's going to look like a standard monopoly model. On the other hand, if you remove the numeraire good and just have the monopolistically competitive firms in the economy, then basically it's going to be a absolute first best economy, everything will be first best option. So it just makes a huge difference what consumers substitute to when they don't purchase your good. So ignoring, yeah.
But can't they always substitute towards not buying something? Okay, can't you compare it to the Dreamland case where there's just no monopolies at all? Wouldn't that always be better? I mean,
No.
I just don't understand.
No, I mean, I don't think consumers can substitute to not buying anything at all because consumers have to satisfy their budget constraint at the end, right?
Yeah, but that constraint only holds with the quality if you assume that all uses are including this ordinary money or earning it.
Yeah, but I don't think anyone's going to be very interested in doing those things. I mean, most people hold on to money in order to buy something with it, right? So, I mean, if you're saying in the future things will be perfectly competitively supplied, then that's an intertemporal competition with something which is perfectly competitively supplied. So, people are always going to be substituting to something else, right? The question is how competitively supplied is that something else? So, sticking with, yeah, go ahead.
But I mean, so rather than burning money, like, they could substitute towards leisure if you also choose how much they're worth.
Yeah, but see, that actually is a great example of exactly the type of problem. So in most economies, there's a tax on labor, right? And so there's going to be some distortive effect of them substituting to leisure as well, right? So, yeah, so, I mean, in other words, that's another thing which is imperfectly competitively supplied effectively because the government is acting as a monopolist and taking away some of your labor income, right? So essentially anything that the consumer substitutes to, at least potentially, has some market power. Correct? Yes,
Is this, I'm not sure I understand this. Is this saying that there's several monopolies, just that the marginal deadweight loss from one of their market power is zero if they're all the same? Or is it further saying that if all of them together lost their market power, that they wouldn't have any
if
loss?
there's no substitution to the outside good, then and there's only substitution between the monopolists, there is absolutely no deadweight loss from them having market power relative to being perfectly competitive. There is substitution to the outside good. Well, yes, for sure, but the monopoly model is going to dramatically overstate how much deadweight loss there is because it's going to count the full Harvard triangle, whereas you should only be counting a very small part of that, which comes from the substitution to the outside good. So if we stick with the standard version where it is just the Harvard triangle, we can draw these things out graphically very nicely. Let me just show you them. So this is a standard picture. Here you've got the marginal cost curve, which I've drawn as U-shaped, and here's a linear demand curve and its corresponding marginal revenue curve, right? So this area E here, that's the deadweight loss, right? And the deadweight loss is basically composed of two parts. A reduction in consumer surplus up here, and a reduction in the returns, the fundamental returns on the monopoly's capital here. And we can then calculate sort of all the quantities that we're interested in based on this graph. So where's the monopoly's profit? Well, it's the area between price, which is right here. We get that from intersecting marginal revenue with marginal cost, drawing the line up to the demand curve and over to the price. And then we can take the area between price and marginal cost for the monopoly's profits. But notice we should also be able to take the area between marginal revenue and marginal cost, right? So if you integrate the difference between marginal revenue and marginal cost, that's exactly marginal profits. And therefore, that should be the same. What's that area? Well, here's marginal revenue, the red line. And then the marginal cost is the yellow curve. So this area A plus C should be the same as the area D plus C, which it is because these triangles here are similar, right? To get consumer surplus, we can either measure it as the area underneath demand and above the price, as we usually do, or we can measure it as, so if the monopoly could capture all the value in the market, she would get the area between the demand curve and the marginal cost curve, right? So whatever is not captured by her must be exactly the consumer surplus. So that's the area B plus D, right? And again, that's the same as A plus B, because D and A are the same thing. Okay. So when we say the word monopoly, it sounds a lot like this is the only company out there, right? I mean, that's sort of like almost the definition of what monopoly means, right? But the basic mechanisms that we are considering apply to any firm that doesn't take prices as given, right? And the size of the distortion obviously depends on the elasticity of demand. So we can make, we can make it small by, having elasticity be high or close to competition, or large by having it low. But it doesn't really require that this is the only firm out there. So a natural question is when we should apply a monopoly model to think about a situation with market power, or when we should apply a oligopoly model, which we'll study later in the course. Is Munso here? Yeah. What do you think are some reasons why it might be useful, or what do you think might be some of the limitations of using a monopoly model rather than an oligopoly model?
Monopoly model is very restricted setting, but it's simple to analyze.
Yeah. So I mean, we can always think of a firm as being a monopolist, given some residual demand curve that it has, taking fixed what other firms are doing. But in what cases do you think that analysis would miss out on important effects?
Corporate effects between the holders.
Well, that we can actually capture pretty well using the monopoly model, because you can just say, look, if I think the other firms are going to reduce their price when I reduce my price, then you can just incorporate that as my demand curve becoming more elastic, or less elastic. So I actually don't think that poses a basic problem for using a monopoly model to analyze the problem. And does anyone else have any ideas of what are the problems? Yeah.
Can you use oligopoly when you have some kind of strategic interaction?
So again, I think that a lot of those types of things, the question is, for what types of analyses or problems does that change things so we can't represent it by just some residual demand curve? Yeah. So I think that's a very good point. So when we want to think about issues of what is the effect of a new firm entering into the industry, obviously a model that only has one firm is not going to be very useful for thinking about that type of a question, right? So if we're thinking about just the behavior of one firm, the monopoly model works pretty well, except that you have to notice that what do we use models for? We use them to figure out what are the effects of various interventions we can make on an industry, right? Like if we put on a tax, or if we put on a regulation, what will happen, right? And the problem is the monopoly model only looks at the direct effects of those interventions. It doesn't think about how the residual demand curve is going to shift as a result of those interventions, and that's exactly what the oligopoly model and strategic interactions might help us to think about. Right? Another thing is that the monopoly model, as I was pointing out, ignores the effect that I have on the profits being earned by other firms. Right? And so that's going to lead it to systematically overstate dead weight loss, because it doesn't take into account the spillovers that me selling less has on other firms being able to sell more, and therefore earning greater profits. Third, as, what's your name? Gabriana said, the monopoly model doesn't allow us to think about changes in the structure of an industry. It doesn't let us very effectively think about the entry of a new firm. It doesn't let us think about the effects of a merger between two companies, because there's only one company to think about. So monopoly models, when we're trying to think about issues that inherently involve how the industry structure is changing, are not very useful. Nonetheless, I think that